Thinking Aloud, conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with parapsychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today, we're going to look at philosophical specters, hauntings, and exorcisms. My guest is Jacob W. Glazier, an adjunct professor in the Department of Positive Human Development and Social Change at Life University, USA, located in Georgia. He's also an online adjunct professor in the Department of Applied Psychology at New York University Steinhardt campus. In addition, he's a licensed counselor with a background in parapsychology. Jacob is the author of Arts of Subjectivity, a new animism for the post-media era. This is really going to be an in-depth exploration of some of the nuances of the deconstructionist movement in philosophy and the postmodernist, post-structuralist philosophy of Jacques Derrida. Now, I will turn to the internet interview. Welcome, Jacob. It's a pleasure to see you once again.
Hi, Jeff. Good to be with you.
Your work, I think, is very unusual for a parapsychologist in that you're delving quite deeply into European philosophy, phenomenology, post-structuralism, postmodernism, where the terms that are familiar to parapsychologists, such as specters, hauntings, and exorcism, are used in a philosophical context. And it strikes me that the two contexts are not completely unrelated from each other.
Yeah, that's right, Jeff. I think that, in parapsychology, we see some of these concepts as more material, maybe more concrete, as entities that actually may or may not exist in the world. And I think, what we do philosophically is we use these as kind of metaphors in some ways and try and explore how these metaphors or concepts can kind of help shape thinking and thinking about abstract concepts like time, economic systems, even space. And I think, what we're going to get into today, Derrida does a really good job of that in his book, Specters of Marx.
He refers, I understand, to the opening lines of the Communist Manifesto published in the mid-19th century, in which Marx and his co-author Engels write that a specter is haunting Europe.
That's right. That's that famous line in the Communist Manifesto. And I think, Derrida runs with that. He takes that and he kind of, in the spirit of deconstruction, which is his kind of philosophical project that he inaugurates, he, explores how that sentence that a specter is haunting Europe, how that might be very literal in some ways. And the way he does that is through his understanding of temporality.
I understand he also points out that, interestingly, Marx himself was influenced by Shakespeare, and Shakespeare in many of his plays, particularly Hamlet, uses specters as a dramatic ploy.
Yes, indeed. And there's this, I think there's this interesting element that the trope or the metaphor of a specter has for thinking about complex ideas like time and space, and it's this what Derrida calls an absent presence. So the specter's there, right? The specter's there in a certain sense, but it also kind of alongside that specific sense, the specter is also absent. And so it's not, strictly speaking, I suppose, a contradiction, right? It's more along the lines of what Derrida, I think, in his work called of grammatology, is what he calls an aporia, or a kind of a paradox in some ways.
Well, I think paradox is very important. It has the same root as parapsychology, and it suggests, when I first got my doctoral degree in parapsychology, Science News ran a story calling me the first of the paradox. But the very idea of a paradox is, I think, essential when we look at psi phenomenon, because they, by their very nature, are paradoxical. They shouldn't happen at all, and yet they do. And I think that Derrida is putting his finger on something very important, as I recall from your interesting paper on his work. He comes up with the concept of hauntology, and he says it ought to replace ontology, the philosophical study of what is real.
Indeed, and on many accounts, that is his kind of strong maneuver, philosophical maneuver that he makes in Specters of Marx, is that he comes up with what traditionally in Western philosophy has been called ontology. Like you say, Jeff, the study of being, right? The study of being, what is, what isn't, what is real, what is not real. And the tactic that Derrida makes here is to introduce how being as present, looking through the lens of hauntology, also contains a kind of mirror or shadow, kind of a specter that is haunting that presence.
I think this is very, very significant for a philosopher to come up with. And I suppose many of our viewers they may have heard of the name Derrida. He's really one of the most influential philosophers of the 20th century. And I think we would do our viewers a service if we could talk a little bit about his background and how he came to be such an important philosopher.
Certainly. So, I think what comes to mind right away is that Derrida comes out of linguistics. So he studied under Saussure, who was a structural linguist. It's a specific approach to understanding the way that words and meaning function in language. And so Derrida evolves that position, and what's sometimes called decompositionalism or post-structuralism. And so looking at the way that, one of Derrida's famous formulas that he comes up with is that there is no outside the text. Okay, so the text itself contains the kind of inherent meaning or anti-meaning, to borrow a phrase from my paper, that kind of necessarily deconstructs itself in some ways. And so that project of deconstruction, showing how the text contradicts itself within its parameters, he carries that spirit of critique forward. And the way he does that in Specters of Marx is that he applies that same procedure to Marxism. And, he has a lot to say on the way that kind of the historical heritage of Europe and of Western civilization has, again, been haunted by this kind of oppositional logic that necessarily deconstructs itself if we are able to kind of bring to the fore presuppositions and contradictions. And that's really at the heart, I think, of Derrida's project.
My understanding is that he wrote the Specter of Marx at a time when, after the fall of the Soviet Union, at a time when many thinkers were saying communism is dead for all intents and purposes. And what Derrida was trying to maintain is that the communist critique of capitalist society is not at all dead. Even if communism per se is dead, the critique of capitalism is stronger than ever.
Indeed. And not only that, but I think Derrida wants to carry the banner of Marxism forward. And just as you say, Jeff, that spirit of critique that is so kind of intrinsic to a Marxist position, Derrida reappropriates that under his own auspices. And I think that he fits well with a lot of his colleagues in the kind of post-structuralist, postmodernist camp. Or I think what may be a better term for that would be today called critical theory. Or even there's, in Ian Parker is a critical psychologist that applies these kind of critical procedures to, understanding the way, if you want to take like a Foucauldian perspective, the way power functions in institutions, or at the level of language or meaning, to take a more deconstructionist perspective, the way power functions or doesn't function within certain texts or certain language communities, one could say.
I don't know how familiar our viewers are with deconstruction in general. I think it's had a massive influence in academia, particularly in terms of the feminist theories, deconstructing the male dominance in practically every discipline. But it goes much beyond that.
It does. It has had some of its influence has, for better or for worse, has waned, I feel, in the last several decades. Certainly after the culture wars in the 80s, where it was kind of proliferated in literary departments across the United States and elsewhere. It sits in a precarious place right now. I think especially, given the current administration in the United States, has been kind of famously called the post-truth world. I think deconstruction, while certainly doesn't, argue that there is no fact or that there is no truth. Nonetheless, it sits in this kind of strange position right now. And so I think it'll be interesting to see how it evolves and where it goes. But nonetheless, Jeff, I think you're certainly right that feminists, critical race theorists, if we want to talk about, present realities going on right now, critical race theorists have used the methods and procedures of deconstruction along with queer theorists to look at the way that power is inherited by a very specific, in some ways, group of people, or it's carried along through certain social institutions or certain ways of doing language, would be a different way to put that.
I mean, I am under the impression that the postmodernists have taken the position that there is no such thing as a bedrock absolute truth. Would you disagree with that?
I would. I would because I believe it depends, to do a very, to be rigorous and nuanced in our thinking. I think we have to look at the specific theorist or philosopher or author that we're talking about. It may be a red herring to say that, postmodernists reject all truth claims, but, I've heard the kind of, cliched argument that claim in itself is a universalist claim. So to claim that, all truth claims are rejected is making a substantive claim in itself. So it contradicts itself in some ways, but, I think postmodernism has gotten a bad rap. And I think that, if we look more at the ideas and thinkers in like critical psychology, even deconstruction or more strictly speaking, post-structuralism, I think, we might, find better results.
It does seem to me that what Derrida is suggesting by the word hauntology, and I think it's amazing how many words Derrida has coined himself. And I think you're engaged in a similar project. I'm pretty sure your writing also coins a few words along the way. But isn't he suggesting that the concept of the specter is a new concept in a way? It's sort of halfway between being and non-being, and it has to be acknowledged as a new ontological category.
So it's not necessarily ontological. I think I have here that this, it might be helpful just to quote Derrida here, his definition of hauntology. He says that ontology opposes it only in a movement of exorcism. Ontology is a conjuration. So we can see that there's this double movement where there's this kind of exorcism of the substance, if we want to return to kind of old-fashioned metaphysical tropes. At the same time, there's a conjuration. So there's this bringing into being and this kind of expulsion that happens. Whereas that's hauntology. Whereas conversely, if we look at, let's say the ontology of Heidegger, who, is a famous, in a lot of ways, I suppose, a famous teacher of Derrida, or follows in that kind of lineage. Heidegger doesn't have that same kind of violent connotation that hauntology brings about. Nor does Heidegger have the same kind of metaphorics that fit into the trope of a specter, this kind of haunting or tormenting or even torturing of the substance. For Heidegger, it's more of a playful unveiling or revealing, this kind of much more gentle kind of subtext. And for Derrida, that just certainly isn't the case.
One of our guests on the New Thinking Aloud series, the philosopher Jason Reza Georgiani, I did an interview with him about 5 years ago on a concept that he developed called the spectral revolution, and in which he felt that we really need to look at, and I may be misinterpreting him, but I think he's talking about entities like devas, demons, daemons, deities, jinns, elementals, fairies, gnomes, discarnate entities of all sorts, that they exist in spectral form, and we need to acknowledge that. He saw the spectral revolution as one in which our mainstream acknowledged reality would begin to include these sorts of elements. And I think he was also building on Derrida.
I think that's great. I think that, I think if, Derrida's project, I think, is a little bit different because he's not necessarily, naming these beings or, developing a kind of cosmology per se. But certainly, Jason Georgiani's work, I think, really does build on this notion of hauntology that Derrida philosophically introduces and kind of gives us, I suppose, the conceptual equipment, to think about how might things like elves or fairies or ghosts or jinn, how might these things exist when we can't see them?
Yeah, occasionally they do become quite visible. There are all sorts of reports of people who claim that they're quite tangible, at least at times, and then they can evaporate. But I'd like to push this a little further. You mentioned the term exorcism, that Derrida describes the relationship between ontology and hauntology as involving exorcism of some sort. What does he mean when he invokes that word?
I suppose to build on what I was saying earlier, I think this kind of exorcism gets at, there's a certain violence that hauntology brings to bear on understanding the way that the world works. And this kind of, I suppose to put it into different language, if we're to build something else must be destroyed. And it brings to mind images from Hinduism, like Shiva the Destroyer. So there's this element that destruction is the necessary condition of creation. And I think what Derrida does is to slightly shift the semantics or the metaphors to what I would consider appropriately parapsychological. And so he uses, these paranormal or spiritual terms, right? Like exorcism versus conjuration. And those are the two movements in hauntology. You have an exorcism, but you also at the same time have a conjuration. And, we could oppose that to, more Hinduistic terms like creation, destruction. And so there's a certain, I suppose, homology between the two ways of thinking about this.
Now, I'm under the impression that when Marx talked about a specter that was haunting Europe, he was referring to communism, and which in the mid-19th century was a very fledgling movement. So maybe he was giving himself a little too much credit when he said it's haunting Europe. And I think he goes on to say that the capitalist regimes and monarchies and so on that were active in Europe at that time were trying to exorcise the specter of communism. And now, writing in the present, after the fall of the Soviet Union, Derrida is sort of suggesting that, well, communism may have been exorcised, but the specter still remains.
Certainly. And I think, Derrida develops that further in Specters of Marx. And it's a concept he comes up with that I employ in my paper called global Latinization. So how we have the colloquial term of globalization. We think about how globalization has swept the world through technology, media, capitalism, so on and so forth. Well, Derrida comes up with this term global Latinization. So the world is, and this is where elements of what is kind of elements of religion or what is more theoretically called messianism come into play. Derrida's examination of messianisms through the various earth religions, right? Like the expectation of a coming Messiah. And he doesn't use the word globalization, but global Latinization grounds the kind of entrapment of the world in a religious sense. So there's a Christian, more specifically really, a Christian root that has kind of flared up and has encircled the planet and is in a lot of ways, I suppose, strangling the planet to death. And I think that part of Derrida's strategy here is to employ tropes that might challenge typically held Christian ideas. And some of those tropes that we've used today have been exorcism, conjuration, even, torture, torment. And so I think that, I think Derrida is very, very aware of that. And I think his project in Specters of Marx is specifically to try and deconstruct how the concept of messianism, or this kind of how we wait for the Messiah. And this is where his notion of temporality comes into play. That we're always waiting. We're waiting for, the apocalypse. We're waiting for the big culmination, the big event to happen. What I think Derrida points out is that, that in a lot of ways keeps people trapped. Not unlike how capitalism creates the proletariat. It creates a different class system. And so I think that, what Derrida tries to do is to try and further develop or empty this messianism of content, and he develops this other concept which he calls messianicity. Not to say that he's creating all these ideas for no reason, right? Part of it, again, I think we have to ground ourselves in the method of deconstruction. And this is this kind of countering, using, metaphors or different figures to challenge kind of concretized notions that have been sedimented in language and in discourse. And so that's what Derrida is doing here.
I think he's also ties this to the concept of justice, that people think, someday in the future, the Messiah will come and there will be a reckoning and all of the wrongs will be corrected. Is he there by trying to suggest, no, that we have to work harder to correct those wrongs, to find justice in the here and now and not wait to some distant future time? Is that what he's getting at?
I think that's a great practical and pragmatic way to put it, Jeff. That we, this kind of idea of just waiting, deferring kind of social justice, deferring social action, I think is pathological. And I think Derrida is pointing that out. And not only is it pathological, but it's intrinsic. He makes this claim in Specters of Marx that this kind of anticipation is intrinsic to capitalism. And so if we just wait, we'll, gather enough money so that we can safely retire. It's this kind of passivity, I think, that creates this kind of the labor class, And so I think that to demand social justice now is, I think part of what Derrida is getting at with trying to critique the kind of time structure of messianism.
There's a sense that I have that many people who are unhappy with the idea of the New World Order are basing their thinking on Derrida, because in a sense, the New World Order is represented, especially the way it was used by George H.W. Bush, as, the triumph of capitalism over Marxism. And the idea that we are now in a global culture which is capitalist, and the marketplace is now global, and everybody will have color TVs and cell phones. And Derrida is pointing out, we're still destroying the planet. We still have huge masses of people who are starving, and the social problems that capitalism has created are stronger than ever. I think he even goes so far as to say the world has never been in worse shape.
You're right. And he calls this the New World Order. And so the term Derrida uses is the New International. And so one of the ways he looks at this is that, on some level, we still have countries, we still have, these notions of borders, this kind of notion of separation. But on another level, I think Derrida sees a much covert power working behind the scenes, so to speak. And that behind the scenes is this kind of specter that Derrida is trying to warn us about, that comes along with the capitalist system. And the specter doesn't have borders. The specter doesn't abide by the laws of different nations. It's this much more dispersed and pervasive kind of power that does what it wants in a lot of ways. And I think that, you're right to maintain that if we can see evidence of that today. And Derrida would echo this point in how capitalism has wreaked havoc on the planet and the ecology of the various, ecosystems around the world. And so I think that I think that it's a warning in a lot of ways. Derrida gives us. And I think that, we need to pay attention to that warning, because I think that ghost, that global ghost of global Latinization will rear its head. And I think we're seeing that today in many ways. Certainly in the United States, we're seeing this specter of racism haunt or pop up all around our large cities and elsewhere. And the way Derrida would analyze that is that there's this kind of something that hasn't been dealt with, right? And so that's that grinding of the exorcism versus conjuration. So I think he would see these kinds of protests and so on and so forth. He would see these things as a positive development, because that's part of that kind of violence of hauntology. This kind of there's this exorcism while there's this conjuration. And so I think, that ghost or that specter, that global ghost, is rearing its head in a lot of ways. And, it'll be both interesting and scary, to stick with the metaphors that Derrida uses, to see, how this, is going to kind of play out.
I think it's fascinating, Jacob, that at around the same time that Marx wrote that there's a specter haunting Europe, the spiritualist movement in the mid-19th century became a worldwide movement as well. And the spiritualist movement led to psychical research and parapsychology. We now have 150 years of data in these areas. And yet, the mainstream institutions of global culture, the scientific establishment, the business establishment, pretty much goes on, with very few exceptions, as if 150 years of documented evidence of, in effect, real specters didn't exist. It's become, highly marginalized in a global sense. And I wonder if there isn't some correlation there.
There's a certain tradition or heritage, what Derrida calls Phallogocentrism. I know that's a mouthful to get a hold of, but there's this, he puts it, elsewhere, he calls it the metaphysics of presence.
Let's break that word down, phallogocentrism. So phallus, right? The beginning of the word, right? There's it is an allusion to the phallus, which is the male genital or private parts. The middle of the word logo or logos is the Greek, the Latin word for the word or language. And then centrism, this kind of privilege, I suppose we could say, that has been afforded to both the phallus and into the word. And so, again, that's one of those kind of neologisms that Derrida creates. But nonetheless, what he, I think, is trying to point out is that indeed, the heritage of Western civilization specifically has been predominantly a patriarchal kind of heritage. And it also has privileged writing over speech. And that's a whole separate, it's a very advanced and developed argument that Derrida makes with regards to that. The way that, why writing, privileging writing over speech, has caused or has created kind of the state of affairs of where we find ourselves. And he goes into that quite a bit, but, nonetheless, I think the way that, to return to your comment or your question, Jeff, the way that phallogocentrism relates to the kind of ostracization of
paranormality, is that certainly from the Enlightenment on, there has been a certain privilege afforded to certain methods of science, what we would call scientism. Specific kinds of experiments are taken to be more true than others. And, certainly with the rise of qualitative research, this has been a great advance, in my opinion, for, parapsychology and for the study of the paranormal. That we take seriously the stories and the narratives and the experiences, the lived experiences of claimants and participants. And, I think that data is just as valid, if not more valid, than the quantitative data that the physicalists or the experimentalists gather. And so, it would take a bit to kind of sustain that argument. But I think the way that Derrida would kind of enter that pathway would be through this understanding of Phallogocentrism that is intrinsic to Western thinking.
It dawns on me just as we're speaking, Jacob, here on the New Thinking Aloud channel, I try to present what I regard as the best, most reliable information concerning the paranormal. So I rely heavily on authors such as yourself with published works. And I realize that as a result of that, my guests are predominantly white males. Overwhelmingly, as a matter of fact, white males. And today I was looking at a book written by a Native American who grew up on the Pine Ridge Reservation. He's had extremely profound experiences, but he doesn't have a doctoral degree like you have or like I have. And so his book is full of all sorts of grammatical mistakes and constructions that I would normally regard as unacceptable, not the King's English. And I'm beginning to rethink that maybe, by relying so heavily on people whose works have been published in books, I may be excluding very important segments of people's experience.
I think you're exactly right, Jeff, to be honest with you. And I think not to belabor the kind of data that's privileged in parapsychology, but that also speaks to a certain form of privilege. And I think, we need to, as a discipline in parapsychology, we need to self-reflect on, our members, who we're holding up as colleagues, do we have diverse voices? And if we don't, then what does that say about our discipline? And what does that say maybe about our kind of presuppositions, our methods? Where did we get those methods from? Why do we still have those methods? And so I think, yes, absolutely. I have been afforded a very privileged place, and that has allowed me great advantage to be able to graduate with a PhD. And because I have done that, I have a certain standing. And I think, even to return to the level of writing that you brought up a bit ago with regard to the Native American author, Derrida would certainly see the kind of policing of grammar and diction and syntax and all of those things that you pointed out as a function of the very kind of phallogocentrism or the kind of power structure that keeps people subjugated. And so Derrida, I think, would be on our side on this. And I think that, I think to listen to the stories and to read the stories of people that, don't fit into a specific language community, right? And what I mean by that, aren't able to write a certain way, so on and so forth. I think we have to put forth the effort to do that, because we're not taught to do that, unfortunately.
Another thought that came to me in the course of our conversation is this battle that you pointed out between exorcism and conjuring. It strikes me that there are a lot of elements in our culture, and probably parapsychologists are amongst them, where we don't like to admit it, but we're actually endeavoring to conjure up a world in which psychic functioning is accepted and acknowledged. And those people who call themselves skeptics and rationalists, and we label them as following the dogma of scientism. They're trying to exorcise that world. They don't want such a world. They think it's the rising tide of superstition. They want to banish it. And it seems as if that's really the great metaphysical battle that's going on in our culture. And it has been going on for the last 150 years.
Absolutely. And I think, what Hauntology has to say about that is that the more you kind of battle against it, the more that specter returns to haunt. And so, there's this, again, this back and forth of exorcism and conjuration. But, nonetheless, if we look to, a different project outside of deconstruction, developing maybe a certain worldview or cosmology that, can be found in the work, in like paraanthropology. I'm thinking about different forms of animism. Even in my book, The Arts of Subjectivity, I try and, sketch a way of looking at the world through a kind of animistic lens. And that just means the way that we are intertwined with spirits and different beings that we can't necessarily see. And so while Derrida doesn't do that, he gives us the tools to kind of bring about that, what Jason Giorgiani calls a spectral revolution.
Well, Jacob Glazier, this has been a very exciting, interesting, profound conversation. I'm delighted to be able to share it with our viewers. You have a very unique and I think significant perspective on the world, Jacob. Thank you so much for being with me.
Good to be with you, Jeff.
And for those of you watching, thank you for being with us.